Well, welcome here. I want to welcome everybody here today. My name is Jim Lindsay. I'm director of the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law. We are going to be having an informal roundtable on the state of U.S.-Russian relations, which clearly in recent months there's been a lot to talk about. Not too long ago, President Putin at Verkunda was sharply critical of American foreign policy, and among other things in his opening remarks complained of one single center of power, one single center of force, one single center of decision-making. This is the world of one master, one sovereign. He was clearly quite critical of that world, and I will note that in polls in the German public shortly thereafter, a large majority of the German public agreed with President Putin. So obviously he was putting his finger on an issue that goes well beyond Russia to broader issues of international relations. And we can explore a little bit in this talk today about how Russians evaluate and see the world abroad, and particularly America's role in it in the future, and the potential for American foreign policy, or for the United States, U.S.-Russian cooperation. We are very fortunate for today's discussion to be joined by some of the preeminent experts on this subject who have, in their personal and professional capacities, worked very deeply. Let me first welcome Vladimir Pechatnov to my left, who is the chair of European and American Studies at Moscow State Institute of International Relations. And for everyone, if you hear us start talking about MGIMO, that is the acronym for Vladimir's home organization. We are also very fortunate here to be joined by Victor Kuvaldin, who is professor at MGIMO, and he is the former director of the International Foundation for Socioeconomic and Political Studies, which I believe is better known as the Gorbachev Foundation. We are also joined by their colleague, Mikhail, Troitskiy, who's the Deputy Director of the Academic Educational Forum on International Relations, as well as a Professor of International Relations and Russian Foreign Policy at MGIMO. And he is also a Senior Fellow, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for U.S. and Canadian Studies. Misha wins the prize for having a title even longer than my own. We are also very fortunate to have here some other guests. We have Mark Kramer, who is the director of the Harvard Project on Cold War Studies. He's been very kind to join us. We're also very fortunate to have Ethan Kapstein, who is the Paul Dubrulli Professor of Sustainable Development at INSEAD, which is based in Paris in France, which I'm told is actually smaller than Texas. So I have to get that officially on the record.
But equally chauvinistic.
Okay. And finally, we are very fortunate to have Frank Gavin, who is the Director of Studies here at the Robert S. Strauss Center, as well as holding the Tom Slick Professorship here at the LBJ School at the University of Texas at Austin. What we've agreed to do is keep this conversation relatively informal. I would first ask everybody, if you have one of these devices or a cell phone, if you could either turn off its wireless feature, which I'll do mine right now, or put it on mute so that in the middle of the conversation we don't start hearing Tchaikovsky's William Tell Overture or other sorts of musical accompaniment. I would greatly appreciate it. What we agreed is we're just going to allow each of our panelists to make a few brief comments. We'll have a little discussion among ourselves, open it up to discussion and questions from everybody in the room. But I'm going to actually ask Vladimir to start us off if he could.
Thank you, Jim. Let me try to throw a few observations on the current stage of our relationship by saying first that we hear a lot about the new Cold War, which is either started or about to start. These rumors, I think, are slightly, grossly exaggerated. The Cold War was a unique historical phenomenon, which is not going to be repeated in any way. What we have now, I think, is a combination of partnership in certain directions and some competition in others, which is normal in today's world. I would call it selective partnership, restricted partnership. We have common interests, we have different interests, we have parallel interests sometimes. There are real disagreements about many things, but I would say that the current atmosphere on both sides can be explained by going beyond these rational disagreements and has more to do with psychology. Basically, it's the history of our relationship until now, I mean, the last 15 years, was a story of unrealized expectations. On the American side, both on public and elite level, you were too optimistic about the Russian transition to markets and democracy, American style, and Russia becoming a sort of a junior partner in this new brave world, sister republic, as Woodrow Wilson used to say. When that didn't happen, Americans went into the usual cycle: disappointment and frustration, and then demonization of the current situation in Russia and Putin personally as a new Stalin, or even worse. This happened before, this cycle of naive expectations and disappointments and frustrations. I would just refer you to the great reforms of the Alexander II in 1860s, same thing. Repeated itself again in the early 20th century, then with the February Revolution, and that short-lived democratic experiment. And each time, this idealization, disappointment, frustration, demonization, with the final verdict being that Russia lost her way, stood on the wrong path, etc. Now I think Americans are more or less in this demonization phase of the cycle again, with Russia being what, again, as I said, Putin is compared to Stalin, and Russia on the human rights and democracy scale is compared unfavorably to Zimbabwe and Botswana down the end of the list. We in Russia, that's American, passed to this current stage. We in Russia also went through a somewhat similar cycle. High hopes for democratic transition, for a happily harmonious integration into the family of nations. We also had very high hopes on American assistance in the process. Since the logic was we destroyed the enemy, your enemy, we saved you a lot of money, and some chunk of that peace dividend should go to Russia. We also hoped for qualitatively new world, really. There were some sincere expectations, I think, especially on Democrats' part, that this will be something totally different from the Cold War, that we would be speedily reintegrated into the Western community. When that didn't happen, we began by blaming Americans for almost everything which went wrong, for being very selfish and greedy, for giving little tangible assistance and a lot of bad advice, along the lines of shock therapy and etc. And as a result, we have this wave, which I think is subsiding, of negative, almost anti-American feelings, and some demonization of United States in certain circles. But I would argue that we are coming out of this phase now. We learn from experience. We're becoming more sober, I think, and realistic about the world and about America, about ourselves too, about our possibilities and opportunities in today's world. And perhaps Americans also, to strike an optimistic note, being somewhat sobered by the recent experiences in this hegemonic role in the world, and Iraq, of course, going through this agonizing reappraisal of their own, would come out of it more realistic, more humble, if you wish, and more understanding of the need of taking this reality and other centers of powers into closer consideration. So that's maybe the ground may be laid for a more stable and more realistic relationship, if we speak about the psychological dimension of it.
Okay. Well, thank you,
I went
Vladimir,
for too long on this.
well, thank you. A very eloquent set of remarks. You set the standard high for the rest of us. Victor.
Thank you. As far as I know, there is such thing in this country as presidential privilege. Without any reasonable doubt, there is something similar in my country, presidential privilege. At the same time, I think all of us have non-presidential privilege. My view of the world, my assessment, is a little bit different from my president. I completely agree with Vladimir that perception, misperception are playing a huge role in our relationship. But I would like to say to you on this count, there is known Bismarck, German Chancellor, saying, Russia is never so strong or so weak as it seems. On my part, I would like to put it a little different. Russia is never so good or so bad as it seems. I think there is something very real behind our disagreement at these times. First of all, of course, our relationships are complex. We were two superpowers quite recently by historical standards. We were, during the 90s, we were probably unique example in world history when world power in peacetime has gone down so quickly and so deeply. And of course, it left its traces not only in Russian view of the world, but in our relationship too. I see now, of course, after 2000, we have a rather reasonable rate of growth, all in all around 6% a year. It is not Chinese one. It is more similar to India. We have reestablished because after national catastrophe of 90s, we have lost this breakup of Soviet Union one quarter of our territory, 1/3 of our economic potential, 1/2 of our population. It is more than you can lose in big world war. At the same time, it is my opinion, we haven't lost any war. We have finished Cold War on very decent and very acceptable for our terms. It is different story. But now we are reestablishing, as I said, it is not only on economic, but our imbalances, our structural imbalances remain. No, first of all, we are not equal. We would like equal partnership, but we are not equal. Our economy is 1/10 of American one, not more. It depends how you count. You can count on rate of exchange rate, or you can count on purchasing power parity. It's different count, but the result is not very different. Oh no, it's about 1/10 of American economy. Of course, our political and social system are more weak. If you would like to make some comparison between Russia and United States. It is not United States today. It is much more similar to what was going on in this country in the second half of 19th century, in so-called Gilded Age, with this rampant capitalism, without morals, without law. For this reason, it is, of course, it has huge impact on our relationship. And I agree with Vladimir on one very important point: how we can resolve this puzzle. Because on one hand, we are not ready to accept our status as junior partner or proxy or client of United States. No, this is not absolutely unacceptable for Russia, for Russian allies, and for Russian public in general. On the other hand, we are not equal. We are not equal. We have to understand it. I think the problem is on both part of it. As I can see, probably I am wrong. United States have not equal partnership with any country in the world now. We are not exception. We are not exception from this point of view. But how we can go out from these dead ends? And I proposed some years ago really some kind of limited partnership. My view is that we have to cooperate with United States in the area where United States are interested most in cooperation with Russia. No, it's obvious. Non-proliferation, fight against terrorism, regional conflicts from Middle East to Far East, energy dialogue, probably to some extent post-Soviet space. And we have not to try to go beyond it. Because I really say, I can say openly, I don't believe in our strategic partnership. Because, as I said, we are not equal, and United States is not interested in it. But in every case, we have to go cautiously and taking in mind objective limits of our partnership in foreseeable future.
Okay. Thank you, Victor. I want to actually come back to the question of how you manage relations in the context you, I think, so ably laid out. But let's bring Misha in if we...
Thank you, James. Well, let me offer you a few thoughts on the context, and if there's time, on the current substance of US-Russian relationship. I will try to talk about more short-term issues rather than the very broad vision for US-Russian relations. Well, I would first argue that the Russian foreign policy is increasingly driven now by domestic considerations, as opposed to all sorts of international constraints and trends that occurred outside of Russia. It's becoming less reactive. It may be at the same time not proactive on the international stage, but it is proactive from the internal point of view. Russia is trying to set certain tasks for its foreign policy that are motivated by its domestic by certain domestic issues, and all these domestic constraints, all these domestic concerns in Russia, such as the upcoming legislative and presidential elections, the debate on ways to spend Russia's oil money, and so on. All these issues somewhat deflect attention from foreign affairs and from the agenda of U.S. relationship. And this feeling is actually enhanced by the feeling that the permanent crisis is over in Russia. And this kind of crisis, typical of the 1990s and also of the transition, of the early transition period, late 1980s, early 1990s, that crisis has been averted. And Russia can largely disregard the advice and opinion of external powers, including the United States. In the atmosphere of this crisis, of course, Russia had to heed the views of the US that who actually stood behind international monetary institutions and was an important political partner in Russia. Now, this increased attention to domestic concerns and also the feeling that there's no immediate crisis on the horizon actually somehow deflects attention from relations with the United States. Now, in addition to that, some hardcore nationalists in Russia, but also part of Russia's foreign policy apparatus, expect the United States to grow weaker in light of Iraq and Iran and some other trends, as well as domestic problems President Bush is currently facing. And obviously, some figures in the United States also expect Russia to gradually lose its influence if, say, oil prices go down. And in such situation, both sides consider it expedient to wait and see what happens next with the other side, instead of engaging right now. And that's, I think, psychologically, that's an important constraint on the development of mutual relations. These mutual expectations of of the other side getting weaker with time. At the same time, public relations campaigns really gather momentum. Both Washington and Moscow want to improve their image in Russia and the United States respectively. And many efforts undertaken in this field clearly miss the point, but some others may help both sides to create a basis for engagement in the future. And I think our visit here is also part of public diplomacy outreach effort, you know, on the Russian side. And there's another point I'd like to stress, that surprisingly the growing international exposure of the Russian political and business elites, as well as Russia's middle class, has not affected the strong sense of Russian national interests as distinct from American or European or whoever else interests. That's an interesting point. Some of the U.S. Aid programs were premised upon the notion that as long as you increase this international exposure of the Russian people, and especially of the Russian elite, their affection towards the West and the willingness to reconsider some of Russia's hardcore national interests would increase. But I think it's not happening. The more the Russian elite sees the outside world, the more reserved it is about the commonality of interests between Russia and the outside world, and the United States in particular. Well, let me stop at this point, not deeping into the details of Russian-US relationship, but I'd be glad to tackle that during Q&A and discussion.
Terrific. Thank you, Misha. For all the Americans in the audience, it comes as a shock, an absolute shock, to discover that domestic politics is affecting Russian foreign policy. Unheard of here. Ethan, you sort of have followed U.S.-Russian relations for quite some time, but you have the added advantage now of sort of watching it from the perch in Europe. If you sort of place it in context for us, I guess it would really help.
Right. It's interesting because I think in Europe there's a very different set of concerns. First of all, there is no European policy toward Russia. I should make that clear. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure there's even a French or German policy toward Russia. Within European capitals, views about the new Russia are very mixed. You might say, though, The Economist nicely summarized European views toward Russia with that cover showing Putin as a 1930s gangster with the gas nozzle as a machine gun, or where the machine gun would be with the gangster, he has the gas nozzle. And that did summarize, I think, some of the anxieties, of course, that Europeans have expressed about energy's use of Russia's use of the energy weapon. There has been tremendous press in Western Europe about the Russian use of the so-called energy weapon. A lot of coverage of Russian pressure on Belarus, Georgia, Ukraine, with respect to gas supplies, and with European dependence on Russian gas already high and certain to increase, there is, I think, a great deal of anxiety about Russia's apparent willingness to manipulate energy deliveries to advance foreign policy interests. But the anxiety about Russia is not limited to energy. I think there are concerns also widely reported in the European press about democratic rollback, the rollback of democratic institutions. There has been a great deal of coverage of the assassination of journalists in Russia, the takeover of the media, the jailing of oligarchs. So there is, I think, incredible a degree of anxiety in Europe about democratic rollback under this regime as well. And just finally, I'd say something we haven't spoken about at all is Chechnya. Madame Mikhail, who is the French socialist candidate for president, in a recent speech said that she would not let the world forget the war criminals responsible for Chechnya, which again, I think evokes domestic politics in Europe and concerns about how Russia has waged, what might be a domestic war by some measures, but has certainly been fought with extreme brutality, and as I say, something that has been of great concern in Europe. Going forward, though, it might not be any of those issues, Jim, that's of greatest concern. It might be neither energy, Chechnya, or democratic rollback. I think the issue that's really poised to produce significant tensions between Europe and Russia, and that's missile defense. And maybe I'll just leave it at there, because that's also, of course, an area in which U.S., European, and Russian interests will conflict going forward, and we've already seen, particularly with respect to Poland, a lot of concern where Poland has expressed interest in missile defense. Russia has come out very strongly against that. And so there are, I think, a significant set of tensions where also the honeymoon, in a sense, between the new Russia and Europe is over.
An excellent set of remarks. Thank you, Ethan. Mark, you're a long-standing historian of Russia, Cold War relations. Can we get you to make some remarks?
No, thank you, Jim. Let me, I think, just raise a few quick points, which I'll have to do in highly abridged form, but I will be glad to come back. First of all, I would start at the same place that Vladimir did in saying that you do need to keep U.S.-Russian relations in perspective, current tensions in U.S.-Russian relations. If you compare this to the Cold War, and I realize that particularly many of the students in the room won't have any direct memory of what the Cold War was like, but it's hard to overstate how tense the relationship was and how dangerous it was. There was the potential for war. Soviet Union, or at least its allies, were supporting terrorists, if that's an issue that you're concerned about. There was a war raging in Afghanistan. Some of the same issues that are at the forefront today were also present then, but in a different format. So you do need to think about it in perspective, that irrespective of tensions, this is a very different relationship, and it will remain so, in my view. Second issue, what has changed over the last 15 years since the breakup of the Soviet Union that has produced the more tense climate that has arisen over the past few years? I would argue it's not because of Russia's relations with its neighbors. Russia was destabilizing Georgia in the early 1990s and destabilizing Moldova in the early 1990s, had its troops and at times in the Baltic states, and raising questions about whether it would pull them out. So those issues were present then. Russia is behaving at times in a domineering fashion to its neighbors now, but that issue was present earlier. So that's not, in my view, the major issue. One of the issues which Ethan touched on is this trend toward authoritarianism within Russia. That the situation was far from perfect under Yeltsin in the 1990s, but there was this general notion that Russia was evolving into a much more open society, one in which there would be free media, relatively free media. Again, far from perfect, but meaningful elections, which already had come into some question in 1996, but still. Those trends have clearly, I think, gone a more negative direction under Putin, and have really raised quite troubling questions for people who do support democracy in Russia or a more democratic system. And it's not, again, to say Russia's becoming a Soviet Union. It's not. And I remember the Soviet Union, and I can assure you Russia is a very different and will remain a very different place from that. But still, the trend is not a good one. Another important thing, though, that has changed, and this was touched on by Misha and also briefly by Ethan, though, is energy. And there's no question that, that as Victor pointed out, this is a relationship of unequals. And much as we might want it to be a relationship of relative equals, it's not going to become that, except on this one issue, on energy. During the 1990s, Russia was not prominent with respect to energy because energy prices were very low. If you have abundant sources of energy at low prices, then it's not all that important what Russia can provide. In oil terms, in particular, Russia, although it has large reserves, is far from the leading supplier as compared to, say, Saudi Arabia and Iran. But in natural gas, it clearly is by far the dominant, has the dominant reserves in the world. What's changed then is the much higher prices of energy, really the huge increase in prices, and as a result, Russia has become, as is often described, an energy great power, even an energy superpower, and so the cover of The Economist that Ethan mentions harps on that. Very quickly, let me add here is that in addition to the higher prices, though, there's been the assertion of quite heavy-handed state control over the energy sector in Russia. The natural gas sector was always under state control. Gazprom, the large energy natural gas monopoly, was never taken out of state control. There were some shares in it that were privatized, but it's always been a state-controlled organization. But the oil sector was heavily privatized, not very honestly, but was privatized during the 1990s. That's been reversed under Putin, beginning with Yukos, though by no means solely in that regard. And you've had a reassertion through different state-controlled oil companies. And that means that in addition to the higher prices, that you now have the potential for energy to be used much more conspicuously for state ends, which are not always good. The final point I would mention is, though, you do even on this find complications. It's interesting, for example, that Western banks in particular have been active in funding the reassertion of state control over the oil sector. The Financial Times yesterday had an article that discussing the recent announcement of a huge $22 billion syndicated loan for Rosneft, one of the largest of the state oil companies. And it referred here to the rush by Western banks to finance the state's takeover of the energy sector in Russia. And a little bit further on, it mentions, Western banks have been flocking to fund the rapidly growing state-controlled titans of Russia's energy industry, despite concerns in some Western governments over energy security because of the Russian state's growing sway. So it indicates that even when Western governments are somewhat dismayed by what's going on, you will find, though, nonetheless, that there are other segments of Western society that are actively funding some of these very trends. It's the type of thing, I should add, that Jim Lindsay studied back when he was writing about U.S. foreign policy, is the way these different interests can sometimes work at odds. And that just complicates the relationship further.
I thought you were going to say back when I had hair, but that was going back way too far. Frank.
I, too, come to this, looking at this relationship as someone who studied Russia-U.S. relations through the Cold War. And of course, the Cold War, as Marcus reminded us, was a long, bitter, dangerous, ideological divide. But I think unlike a lot of people here, in the 90s, And in the last few years, Russia has not been something that I've thought a lot about. It's not something a lot of people have thought about, and at least in this country. And as I was listening to these comments, which I think the general tone is largely somewhat negative, it struck me that perhaps we're still looking at these things through a Cold War lens, in that would we describe our relationship with China, which has considerably more on any of these issues we've listed, more problem points, would, if we had a similar symposium or similar discussion, would people be looking at these specific points and saying that this is trending badly and this is a bad relationship? And so I would suggest that perhaps we step back a little bit. When I started coming back to thinking about this issue, only came through this partnership that the Strauss Center and the University of Texas is pursuing with MGIMO. And I was struck by the contrast between two totally different perceptions. On the one hand, sort of New York Times, CNN perspective of the relationship, as we know, is one that is problematic and the sense is deteriorating over some serious issues. But I think as we've explored this partnership on both sides, from very top officials involved in foreign policy, involved in business, involved in civil society, everyone is extraordinarily enthusiastic about finding ways to cooperate. And there isn't the kind of suspicion or the kind of concern or the kind of no, you shouldn't do that you would expect. So you're struck by this contrast, what you read in the newspapers. And of course, two large nations with important interests are going to have disagreements. They should. That's healthy. To what extent does that mean that the relationship is somehow bad or unhealthy? And I would just suggest that our history with the Cold War, which in fact was, as Mark correctly points out, extraordinarily dangerous and much different, perhaps it's time to put some of it back and look at this relationship anew. And this also makes me wonder, and I think about this both in terms of Putin's speech and a variety of other things, how much of this is for a domestic audience, how much of this is theater, and how much of this is real. So, you know, as I was writing down the list of issues that we disagree about and the ones where there's possible cooperation, we disagree about Iran, right? But even on that issue, there's some coming together, just like there's been some coming together in North Korea. There's some disagreement about Kosovo. But these are the normal kind of geopolitical differences that states have. There's a variety of other topics. Mark mentioned energy. There's public health. We had a very long discussion about technology and the overlap in interest in technology, concern about the global economy, a shared, if not concern, at least interest in changing dynamics in East Asia, particularly the rise of China. So I do think there is a bit of a puzzle here, and I think this partnership is one of the things that can explore this. Is really the relationship as bad as we all think it is? Are we expecting too much of it? Do we expect too much out of the U.S.-Russia relationship because it was so bad? And I think, as Vladimir pointed out absolutely correctly, too much was expected. On both sides, there are trends that both sides don't like. But I think it's important to put into this discussion the fact that there may actually be far more areas of overlapping interests, concerns, and possibilities for cooperation.
Thank you, Frank. I think it actually is very helpful to emphasize both the complexity of U.S.-Russian relations and the tendency we all have to focus on areas of disagreement and to miss areas of cooperation, which I think leads to sort of really the question I'd like to ask of our Russian guests, and that is, we too have a problem with domestic politics infecting our foreign policy. We too have an upcoming presidential election. At this point, it's fairly wide open. There are an awful lot of candidates on both sides of the aisle who are running. Some of them have taken stands on Russia. Senator Edwards was the co-chair of a task force, independent task force sponsored by the Council on Foreign Relations, which was fairly critical of Russia, particularly on the issue of democratic backsliding. Russia, or issues dealing with Russia, particularly with Iran, are likely to rise during the campaign. So my question to you would be, if you had an opportunity to sit down with a candidate on the American side, and could grab them for, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes, what are the sort of positive things you'd want them to focus on where you think the United States could usefully engage with Russia, particularly given where I think point Victor made and I think Vladimir made about sort of both sort of how we're conditioned to see each other and the reality of the nature of a relationship where we aren't equals, but at one point we were equals, and that sort of governs much of what we do. So in essence, what would be sort of the positive advice that we could give to policymakers in terms of, on the American side, to how to think about Russia, where are the issues we could usefully engage, and how might we do that in a way that would be received well on the Russian side? Because my guess would be that the sort of finger-waving school of American foreign policy may not be appropriate or terribly as effective as we might hope it to be in engaging Moscow. Vladimir, could I just start with you?
It's a good point, Jim, and let me just, well, my advice both to political class and to general American public would be have more empathy and try to understand what's really going on. Don't use the stereotype notions of how democracy should work in Russia, and that's one of the main, of course, irritants this day. Let me just give you a couple of examples which were touched upon, both this democratic backsliding and energy problem. What we have here, I think, is something more complicated than just money, in case of democracy in Russia, than just manipulation from above. Although there is some manipulation, there is no question about it. But it's also a question of which we discussed yesterday, about the democratic transition and the complexity of the process. Thomas Jefferson used to say that you cannot travel from tyranny to democracy in a feather bed. And there will be zigzag on that way, on that path. What we have here is not just manipulation by the Kremlin, but also the inertia of the Russian political system and Russian political culture and tradition, which is heavily authoritarian. So there is a ground for this, which makes public and country receptive to this kind of latent authoritarianism from above. The same happens, I think, with energy. It's not so much, in my view, that energy is being politicized for some clearly foreign policy agenda. It's also a matter of privatizing Russian foreign policy. Because I see Gazprom and our oil sector as a very, and Misha alluded to this very properly, I think, as a very powerful force now in the country. They are in maximizing profits and influence. And that has a lot of influence on the official policy. Don't read it as a very clear-cut, assertive strategy, well thought through by Putin and his team. It's more of a give and take and more of a pressure and lobbying. So that's why my advice would be more humble in judging. Try to understand, have more empathy, try to put yourself into Russia's shoes and see how would you behave in this particular situation. I know it's of little use perhaps, but that's the
It'd
best
still
I
be
can
wise
come up.
counsel, though. Victor.
The same question?
Yes.
My answer would be, first of all, to divide in two baskets. First, what we can and have to do, and second, what we cannot do now. I single out first one, non-proliferation, big issue for you and for us, and our interest coinciding. Terrorism, probably, potentially, bigger threat for Russia than for this country. This country is protected. It's protected by your oceans, by your system, by your society. Our country is much more vulnerable on this point. Third one is about conflicts. I think Russia, probably it's my personal error. I think Russia is much more valuable ally in resolving this conflict than all NATO combined, really. Then energy. I agree with Vladimir. And then somebody mentioned about energy weapons. But what kind of energy weapons? All we would like to have a world price for our oil and for our gas, not more. We have subsidized all post-Soviet country during 15 years. 15 years is enough, because Ukraine now half of price, Belarus 1/4 of price, world price.
Right.
Yes, Baltic states very independent and very anti-Russian. Till recently, half of world price. We see it's enough. This is about democracy. It's of course it's very difficult topic. But what you have to keep in mind, your view, what is going in Russia, and our view are very different. You mentioned us that 90s were promising time, 90s in last century, 90 years. I don't see it in such way, because in 93 our parliament was destroyed with Western support and first of all united support. In 96 we have not free and not fair election. It was completely cheated in first round, on first ballot, completely with Western support. We have very unbalanced constitution, which as I see it, as I know it, was not approved by Russian people, but it was this people was supported. I see if you have Mr. Yeltsin and people around him in this country, he would be very quickly impeached, and people around him would be behind bars as an wrong. This is our view. Of course, Putin, we are not, there are different, I agree with Mark. Mark said, I remember very well Soviet Union. I remember very well Soviet Union too. We have not made great achievement on democratic path in establishing our democracy. But Russia now, paradoxically, is really free country. No, I think it means a lot. It means a lot for me. And then we have to be much more attentive to Russian people, because Yeltsin going from Kremlin, going out, had the level of support zero levels. Putin, on the 7 years, after 7 years in Kremlin, have 70%. Where are American presidents at this stage in White House? And I think we have to pay attention to it, what is really important for Russian people. And for this reason, I don't think probably American president or American politician have to be much more worried about fate of our democracy than we are worried we ourselves. There is a lot of problems. It's a very, I think it's problem number one for us, democracy. But as I see it, it is not much to be done from outside of the country on this topic. We have to do it ourselves. And then Chechnya. Chechnya, of course, it's very, very awful things. But I would like to emphasize that unbelievable atrocity were on both sides of it. And so-called freedom fighters in Chechnya. I don't think you would like to meet such kind of people in the evening on the street. Well, this is all.
Okay. Misha, would you like to join in here?
Yeah, thank you. I've just got 3 brief points. First of all, I wouldn't actually blame this candidate for finger waving if he is one prone to this kind of rhetoric, because I think the distinction between China and Russia in U.S. policy discourse is that the US still considers Russia as one of us, but really one of us which has some problems which does not allow to fully accept Russia as one of us. And I would very much like Russia to be one of the Western developed democracies. And that criticism towards Russia and the absence of this criticism towards China actually proceeds from the assumption that Russia is on our side of the aisle in the US. And China is fine. China is a country which is very much engaged economically by the US, much more than Russia. But at the same time, there's no way China can be one of us. That's a distinction I'm making, and I wonder if you agree with it or not. So I wouldn't very much like the US politicians to shut up and say nothing about Russia's domestic problems and the issues that Mark is raising and all his colleagues and those who think the same way is very good, and I would welcome that really. All kinds of descriptions of Russia's domestic problems during discussions of US-Russian relations. That's very useful. And then, cynically, if I had a chance to talk to a presidential candidate, I would, of course, emphasize common interests and common enemies that Russia and the United States have. I would point to, I would be more intricate about international terrorism. Probably I'd point to some concrete, manifestations that Russia and the US could tackle together, such as small arms or maybe trafficking in nuclear materials. This is something that is impossible to achieve. Say, security of the US is impossible to achieve without cooperation between Russia and US in forestalling the trafficking of nuclear materials, for example. Then I would probably point to a few common enemies. I would say let's look at China in more detail, and then Iran. We are eager to sacrifice part of our interest in relations with Iran, because we really think that Iran can be dangerous should it acquire nuclear weapons. And things like that. So if I think I can convince him, then I will probably do, or her, yeah, I will probably do.
Very good, Vladimir.
Yeah.
Very good.
It may be more of a problem with her than with him, but anyway, that's the way I would try to make my case with a presidential candidate, emphasizing common interests and common enemies. But on a more sincere level, I would first try to understand how important Russia is to this or that candidate, to him or to her. Will he or her be prepared to actually sacrifice other priorities to honor Russia's concerns? I mean, there's a whole school of NATO expansion, for example, which says that you should go ahead with NATO expansion. Russia has swallowed the first round and the second round, and why doesn't it swallow Ukraine? And there's a sense in that. So if he or she belongs to that very camp, then I mean, yeah, some rhetoric about common interests and common enemies may have may be of some use, but very little use really. And there's, of course, a Kissinger way of approaching foreign relations when he talks to you and says, oh, you are very, very important, and we acknowledge that, and we don't like all these liberals who talk about democracy, they are stupid. And then you very much like him, and you shake his hand, and then he goes to the president, to the US president, says, oh, you should really bring Russia to book, and you should balance Russia by developing ties with whomever else. So I mean, if he or she is the same kind of politician, then I think there's the rhetoric of common interests and common enemies is of little use. So if he or she thinks Russia is important, and say there can be some sort of an arrangement or some sort of an understanding in South Caucasus or in Central Asia or in Eastern Europe, then yes, I would go ahead. But if not, then I'll try to just please him or her.
I know Ethan wants to make a comment, and then I want to open the dialogue up to everybody else.
Yeah, just a quick two-finger. Victor said that there isn't much the West could do to help promote democracy in Russia. I do think there are a couple of things the West should have taken much more seriously. One is OECD membership for Russia. I think that should have been granted much earlier, and it's still not on the table. I think China actually will be a member before Russia, and WTO membership. I think institutional lock-in can be critical to democratization. And the failure of the West, I think, to roll in Russia in those institutions, I think, has been a weakness of policy, at least to consider it seriously.
Just a quick comment as well. First, on Chechnya, I mean, here I do very much agree with what Victor said. I do think there tends, particularly in Europe, as Ethan mentioned, there does tend to be a certain degree of sanctimoniousness about Chechnya, and a failure to take account of Russia's perspective. The years from 1996 to 1999, when Chechnya enjoyed a considerable degree of de facto independence, don't give you very much comfort about what an independent Chechnya would be like. It became a bastion of warlordism, terrorism, terrorist training camps, Al-Qaeda presence, rampant kidnapping, criminality, beheading of foreign aid workers. I mean, if I had looked on that period, I wouldn't particularly be enthusiastic about an independent Chechnya. That's in no way to gloss over the indiscriminate brutality with which the war was fought and the brutality that continues under the government of Ramzan Kadyrov. But still, I think there does tend to be a failure to take account, and so it goes to the point that I think it was Misha had mentioned about some degree of empathy. One quick last point here is that on the visa issue, this is one question that I think Western governments, particularly the U.S. government, but not just the U.S. government, could actually do a lot more than has been done. After September 2001, there were new visa regulations imposed that made it extremely difficult, in some cases impossible, for ordinary Russian citizens to come to this country. This shuts out a lot of people we would actually like to have come over here to take part in academic ventures, to be able to learn about what Western societies are like. For various reasons, the process of applying for a visa and actually receiving one for many Russians has become all but impossible. And I think every time I meet with U.S. officials who have some degree of influence on this issue, they acknowledge how counterproductive and stupid the policy is, but it hasn't changed, and that's one issue that I think a lot could be done on.
Thank you, Mark. I think it's safe to stipulate that virtually everybody in Washington agrees the visa system writ large does not work well, but no one seems to be able to find a way to fix it. But I would grant your notion it would serve the United States more broadly to find a way to do it. Particularly universities are hurt by the challenges that crop up in trying to bring in people from overseas, whether they're students or distinguished professors, academics, national opinion leaders. It is a very big problem. But I said we would bring people in to our conversation. If you have a question, all I would ask is that we keep it relatively brief, that it be a question, and that you identify yourself. Yes, sir.
My name is Andy Bamber. I'm a part of the crease department here. And I wanted to ask, my question's kind of hypothetical as well, maybe a bit more naive, but it was mentioned how important oil has been in the development of the Russian economy. Suppose they didn't have the oil. Where would they be today? And let's say the price of oil drops dramatically, where will they be in the future?
You know, I see that this topic is blown out of proportion, because oil is important. Oil and gas is very important for Russia, but but how important? First, it's important as hard currency, because we are selling oil. It's important because for our budget and for our state finance. This is all. If you will take oil and gas as a whole, you can see that at most, it is only one fourth of Russian economy now. Now the Russian growth, we hope that this year it will be 6 or more, is not supported, first of all, by oil or gas, production and extraction. It is supported by two things: consumer boom and investment boom. This is the most important. things which are propelling Russian economy straight ahead. It means that oil is important for Russian finance, but not so important for Russian as economy as a whole.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. Actually, a quick comment. My name is Dmitry Volkov, Center for Energy Economics here in
Okay.
UT. Little comment on the importance of oil and gas. Well, this consumption boom and investment boom is largely due to the influx of the oil and gas money, basically, because you can see the diversification of oil and gas, businessmen into different sectors of economy. But that's my question is, the debate is picking up in the media here in Russia, on the vector of, or change of vector of foreign policy after the change of administration in both countries.
Mm-hmm.
And, when we had elections here, or they had elections here in the US, there was a lot of debate, how the Democrats will start changing the foreign policy and gearing towards, tightening the screws. So what's your take on this? How actually it's a question to everybody who wants to answer it. What's your take on the possible changes to foreign policy after the administration shifts?
In both countries,
In both
or
countries, yes.
let me comment quickly on the U.S. side. Is the study that I think it was Jim mentioned, or Ethan, or maybe Frank, by John Edwards.
I explained it. I
okay.
mentioned it.
Okay, is Edwards is a Democrat. He's not in the forefront of the candidates, but he certainly is a potential candidate. I found his report quite shrill, to be honest. And on the other side, though, on the Republican side, John McCain has taken a stance that's quite similar. A very aggressive stance towards Russia that I'm not sure the circumstances really warrant. I mean, I think they have, again, to go to Frank's point, they're being influenced to some extent by the kind of Cold War image of Russia still. That's again not. I'm more critical of Putin and the trends under him, I think, than some here have been. I actually do think it matters if the state controls television, for example, or if it's cracking down on NGOs, or if it's engaging in blatant denial of certain electoral rights by requiring certain officials to be appointed. Those elections often were flawed in the past, but it still was meaningful to have them. And so I am critical of Putin, but still I find Russia today fundamentally different. And in that sense, I do think that even if someone like an Edwards or a McCain were to get in, that you'd still find a broadly cooperative relationship between the United States and Russia. I don't really see a candidate there who would fundamentally recast it in a hostile way, even those who have talked about it in those terms now.
Hillary Clinton.
Yes. On the Russian side, first of all, we are taking our lessons from Americans, from American citizens. We can be rather critical about our president within our country, but we are not so critical outside our country. You have done example of good civic relation to your powers, to us. And second, I don't expect real change in the Russian foreign policy. Probably on this point, I'm not completely agree with Misha. I think our elites, in broad meaning of the word, are very, very interested in good relationship with West, because the reason is very simple. Their money are here, their property are here, their wife are here, their children are here, their interests are here, and for many of them, their future, their view of their future are here too. And for this reason, it is not the best situation for us, for our country, but for this reason, I think it is strong break on every turn to negative politics toward West and toward United States. For this reason, I am not expecting some kind of real change in our attitude.
Did you want to respond to the fact that Victor took a slightly
Well,
different position? than
which
you
is
did?
which is for sure is that I think America bashing is not going to add up popularity to a candidate in Russia. I don't think it will be meaningful for a candidate to be more critical of the United States than another candidate, as opposed to probably the U.S. political spectrum, when losing someone, losing China, or losing Russia can become an issue in the electoral campaign. I think the Russian public generally is tired of criticism towards the external world, although there's been some threats waving of some external forces trying to unseat the regime, and the color revolutions, of course, were a major factor in raising these concerns. But I think at the moment the people are quite knowledgeable about what's going on outside, and they do not see any reason to criticize the United States, and that's not going to raise a candidate's popularity. That's for sure. I agree with that.
I see we have several people who would like to ask questions. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time, and our guests have a very busy schedule, and we're trying to actually keep them on it. Having been on the flip side of this, where you're going from thing to thing, it's very important to stay on time. So I'd like you all to join with me in thanking our guests for a very stimulating seminar.